In today's video, I'll refinish and repair this thrift store table. This table was made by the Mersman Furniture Company. I'd guess it was probably made in the 1940s or 50s. It looks like it would have originally had a very deep red finish to it, although most of the finish is now gone. What's left of the original finish is in really bad shape, so it will need to be completely refinished. One side of the table had an inlay in the apron. I originally thought that this was probably a decal, but once I started stripping off the finish, I found that it was actually an inlay inlaid into the wood. But the strange thing was that there was no inlay anywhere else on the table, and there was no evidence that there ever was. There was no slot cut into the wood where the inlay would have been, or any marks where it could have been. I'm not sure why that is, but later on in the video, I will add inlay all around. I paid $5 for this, which would probably be $5 too much to most people, but I liked its small size and its simple lines, and I thought it could make for an interesting video, so I bought it. I began, as I often do, by scraping off the old finish. This was an old lacquer finish that was very brittle, and it scraped off easily. Once I got that top coat of lacquer scraped off, there was a layer of color underneath it, probably a stain of some sort, and it was a reddish color. So I kept scraping a bit to try to get some of that off with the scraper. And then whatever was left, I removed with a sander. And this is a veneer, a mahogany veneer, so I was very careful to only sand as much as I needed to so that I didn't go through the veneer, especially on the edges. It's very easy to go through the veneer on the edges. And I started with 120 grit sandpaper. And my goal was to sand as much of that red color off as I could and get the top to a nice uniform color. Here I'm wetting the top down after I sanded it with the orbital sander, just to get an idea of how the veneer is looking. And you can kind of see in the front corner closest to the camera and along that side, it looks a little bit darker than the rest of the top. So I continued sanding to try to get the top to a more uniform color. But this time I just hand sanded it. And I moved up the grits from the 120 to 150 and then 180 until I got the top as clean as I could without going through the veneer. And I did the same process on the lower shelf, but I removed it first from the table. And that just required removing a few screws. Although it didn't require quite as much work because it was in a lot better shape than the top, since it probably didn't get used very much. And then I moved on to the legs and the aprons. And for most of this, I just used a utility knife blade. After I scraped the lacquer top coat off of the legs and aprons, there was still a lot of that red color left in the wood. So that was going to require some sanding, but before I sanded it, I decided just to take the whole table apart. And it wasn't too hard to get the table apart. I first had to remove a few screws that went through the apron into the top. The joint at the corner of the legs and the aprons were held together by a combination of small glue blocks, some of which were missing, and these metal fasteners, which I'd never seen before. I'm pretty sure this table was probably inexpensive even when it was new, and these metal fasteners were probably a cost-saving measure. They just go into a slot in the leg and the aprons and help to hold them together. But it looks like they also caused some cracks in the legs. These are probably stress cracks. After the glue blocks had failed, the table probably became very wobbly, and all that moving around would have put stress on the legs where those fasteners were and then cracked them. So to get them apart, I just had to give it a few taps with a rubber mallet, and they came apart easily. Before I continued sanding these pieces, I wanted to glue up those cracks in the legs. That way, if I got any glue squeeze out onto the wood, I could clean that up when I was sanding it. I put some tape on the legs to help keep the glue off of the wood. To get the glue into the cracks, I used a glue syringe. And then just clamp them up. Once the glue was dry, then I continued sanding, and I used an orbital sander for most of it. I don't usually like using the sander on small pieces like this because it's so easy to go over the edge and round it off. But this red color went so deep into the wood that it was going to need a lot of sanding, and this just seemed like the most efficient way to do it. And I was just very careful to keep the sander flat and not go over the edge. And there's no veneer on these pieces. The legs and aprons are solid wood, so I wasn't in any danger of sanding through a veneer. I just kept sanding until I got the surface nice and clean with none of the red left. Once the sanding was complete, then it was time to put in some new inlay. The inlay that was already in that one side was in bad shape, and it was very thin, and it didn't survive the sanding process. And I also wanted to put inlay in all around the table, so I bought some new inlay. It's not an exact match to the old, but it was similar, and I thought it would work fine. The inlay just needs a very shallow slot to go into. So to make this slot, I used a table saw and raised the blade just slightly to get the depth that I needed, and then just passed the pieces over the blade. The blade that's in my table saw doesn't leave a flat bottom, so I had to flatten that out, but I didn't have a chisel narrow enough to fit in there. So I just took a small screwdriver and sharpened it a bit and used that to clean up the bottom of the slot. And then all I needed to do was glue in the inlay. I used regular wood glue for this. I put some tape on there just to help keep any glue squeeze out off of the wood. And then I pressed the inlay in. And it was a pretty tight fit, but I did give it a few taps with a hammer to make sure it was flush with the surface of the wood. And then I left it to dry. It was a tight enough fit that I didn't need a clamp on it. Once the glue was dry, then I could scrape down the inlay with a utility knife blade. And I only had to scrape it a little bit until it was flush with the rest of the apron. And then it was time to do some color work. Here you can see the leg and the apron sitting on the top of the table. And it's obvious that there's a big difference between the color of the top and the color of the leg and apron. The leg and apron are made of a very light colored wood. I think it might be poplar. It has very little grain pattern in it, and it's pretty pale, except for a little bit of a yellowish color. While the top is a mahogany veneer that's got a pretty nice color, but it's nothing like the leg and apron. So the first thing I did was to use a brown dye stain on the legs and the apron. I had used this dye stain on a previous project and I had some left over, so I decided to use it. And it's just some trans tint brown dye mixed with water. And I didn't seal off the inlay before I did this. I wanted it to absorb some stain. I'm not a big fan of the high contrast of light woods against dark woods. And this inlay has some really light wood in it. I think it's maple. So I wanted to tone down that contrast a little bit and make the appearance of the inlay a little bit more muted. So I just stained right over it. And then I put the dye stain on the legs. And I also used the dye stain on the top just to liven it up a little bit. Once this dye stain dries, it has a chalky, washed out appearance. So to get a better idea of what it's actually going to look like with a clear finish on it, I just put some clear shellac over it. And then I compared it to the top of the table that I had just stained. The top here has already started to dry, so the darker spots are the spots that are still wet. And when I compared the color of the apron against the top, it looked like the top had more of a reddish orange color to it than the apron, which looked more brown. So to try to even this out, I used a gel stain, and the color is called Georgian Cherry, and it's very red. So I wiped that on the apron and the legs, and they did have shellac on them already, so they were partially sealed. So that would cut down a bit on how much this stain could penetrate, but that was okay because I didn't want it to penetrate a lot anyway. I just wanted to change the color a little bit. Once I put this gel stain on, before it dried, I wiped off a lot of it with some mineral spirits. And that took off a lot of it, but it still left a little bit on there. And at that point, it looked a lot better. But I decided to add another gel stain over that Georgian Cherry. and this one is called Candlelight. And this one is a little bit more orangey looking than the Georgian Cherry. And the combination of the two got the color to a good spot where it was a close match to the color of the top. Once all the stain had dried, then I applied a top coat of a clear oil-based satin wipe-on polyurethane to the whole table. Then it was time to reassemble the legs and the apron. I decided not to use these metal fasteners, and I replaced them with some dowels. The metal fasteners just didn't seem like a good idea. I had tried to put them back in, but they really didn't want to go back into the slots, and it just seemed like a good way to crack the legs again. So the dowels seemed like a better way to go. The first thing I did was to fill in the slots that were left from the fasteners with some pieces of veneer. I just glued them in and then trimmed them flush. Once that was done, then I could drill some holes for the dowels. And then I tried a dry fit of the legs and the apron. Most of the joints went together just fine, like this one. But on this joint, the dowel holes weren't quite aligned, and it put some stress on the apron, and that caused the apron to crack right along the joint where the two pieces that make up the apron were glued. It broke at the glue joint. And this may look bad, but it was actually a pretty easy fix. I just had to put some glue in there using a glue syringe, and I used some tape to keep the glue off of the new finish that I just put on there. And then clamp it up. Once it was dry, I adjusted the dowel hole so that the pieces fit together nicely. And then I could glue it all back together. First thing I did was to screw the apron back onto the top of the table. And then I applied some glue. And then clamp them up. And then I could assemble the ends. Just applied more glue and clamped them up. But before I tightened the clamps completely, I installed the lower shelf when I could still get the legs to open up a little bit so I could get it in there and screw it down. Once that was in, then I tightened the clamps. And the last thing I did was to glue in the glue blocks after I had made a few new ones to replace the ones that were missing. And I used a second glue block behind the one I was gluing in, just temporarily, to help get the correct clamping pressure. And here it is, all finished. Thanks for watching.